All right, so in her book, Thinking Its Presence, Form, Race, and Subjectivity in Contemporary Asian American Poetry, Dorothy Wong cogently argues that North American poetry scholars often still treat minority poetry as secondary. Urging for change, she asks, who has the power to decide who gets to sit at the real table of poetry, and what kind of table will it be? This fraught question remains unresolved in poetry studies. However, many scholars suggest that digital spaces can help us to build a more inclusive poetry universe. Wong herself proposes that cyberspace, because it is less governed by institutions, allows writers to more freely express their own ideas about poetry and to push into new formal and conceptual spaces. Yet too often in the humanities, particularly in poetry scholarship, the digital figures as an uninvestigated answer or a solution to our problems. And we hear this in all sorts of ways, that the digital is going to solve our enrollment problems or it's going to solve racial bias in poetry studies. The word becomes a metonym for futurity, change, and democratization. Yet hidden beneath this approach is a persistent frontier mentality that replicates an imperial relationship to space. In other words, when we move into this new space, all of our problems will be solved. As Robert J.C. Young reminds us, colonial legacies continue to structure our environments precisely because, quote, they operate in a dialectic of invisibility and unreadability. In my talk today about how global indigenous poets engage with cyberspace to revitalize oral knowledge systems and imagine sovereignty, I refer to digital spaces as territories to connect the politics of physical space to the politics of virtual ones. The Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez traces the etymology of territory back to its Latin roots to define it as a place from which people are warned off. He examines the history and process of territoriality in his multi-book long poem From Unincorporated Territory about his native island Guahan, or as it is known in the US, Guam. He uses the related term territoriality from anthropology, which refers to how animals engage in patterns of behavior to express ownership over space. To describe territoriality as a behavior underscores how it exceeds the physical boundaries of land. He emphasizes, quote, territorialities are shifting currents, not irreducible elements. This tidal metaphor reveals both the enveloping power of imperial desires, which as he describes see only extant land surfaces, only the closed insular island, as well as their impermanence, thus opening up the potential for their disruption. On the page, Perez engages in various innovative techniques to make Chamorro knowledges that have been discounted by colonization visible, including collage, found text, and multilingualism. What interests me today is how Perez's poetry on the page relates to his online self-curation of his work. Like many poets, he turns to social networking and blogging to build his audience, yet he engages in more than mere self-promotion. He structures his multi-book project From Unincorporated Territory as partial, incomplete, and ongoing to parallel Guahan's struggle for self-determination. His performances in the digital territories of Facebook, Twitter, and WordPress become other sites of unfolding connectivity to challenge the boundary-driven expansion of imperial territoriality. The Mohawk Tuscarora poet, Janet Rogers, takes a similar approach to digitizing her performance poetics. Although she has published 4 books, she primarily characterizes herself as a spoken word artist grounded in Mohawk oratory traditions. As she describes, spoken word is delivered from the body, not the page. It lives in the memory of the poet, then as a remembered experience of the listener. To achieve this, she supplements her publications with live performances and recordings. In her experiments to move beyond the limitations of the page, her most recent collection, Peace and Duress, breaks new ground through its use of social media. And the book has its own Facebook page where she updates live events, recordings, and videos of her poetry. Both Perez and Rogers engage the page in a dynamic relationship with digital forms to recover indigenous oral memory and to protest ecological destruction. For Rogers, this helps her to foreground performance in her work, and for Perez, this helps him to avoid the elitism of page-based experimentalism. They both confront the tyranny of settler colonialism in their poetics and reckon with the impossibility of finding an outside or an endpoint to it. Rather than interpret digital forms as a liberatory departure from land-based struggles, Perez and Rogers invite us to interpret them as vessels that, like print-based forms, require innovation to navigate through the tides of imperialism that threaten to drown out Indigenous lives. What emerges in both of their work is a remaking of poetic space in Indigenous terms. Moreover, their conceptual redefinitions of poetic space as intersubjective and embodied on the page become actualized online. Although there is a rich dialogue between Perez and Rogers' work, First Nations poets and Pacific Islander poets are rarely studied together. Our post-colonial and identity politics frameworks for studying literature keep these two poetry worlds separate. Even within Indigenous literary studies, the emphasis has justifiably been on localism to counteract how the category of Indian strip Native people of their unique cultural identities. When Indigenous groups are studied together, it's typically within a settler nation or a particular geographic region. My global comparative approach responds to the Lakota scholar Chadwick Allen's call for purposeful juxtapositions of Indigenous literatures from disparate regions to displace settler interests and frameworks from the center of intellectual activity. I also take my lead from Perez and Rogers themselves. In their embrace of online platforms, they invite readers to connect to their work across immense distances and to break down the barriers between different communities. To repeat Dorothy Wong's question that I opened with about who gets to sit at the real table of poetry and what kind of table will it be, these two poets help us to construct a table where a lineage of white modernist innovation is no longer at the center and our understanding of poetic space ceases to be tied to a blank page. To borrow terms from Kenneth Sherwood, Rogers and Perez use digital forms to facilitate oral poetry's emphasis on elaboration and versioning, to disrupt the stability of the printed poem as the authoritative master work. Sherwood defines versioning as creating a radically new arrangement of a poem during performance, and elaboration as the improvisational moves that are often not captured in the page version of a poem. So Rogers' first book has an accompanying CD, but Peace and Duress breaks more fully from a page-centric economy through its digital life, which keeps the poems alive and unfinished. So unlike a CD glued into a book, which gives us a one-to-one relationship between the audio and the print version, digital versioning disrupts the idea of a book as a self-contained object. So I'm going to switch now to talking specifically about Rogers' project. So Rogers' video trailer for Peace and Duress is an excellent example of her approach to digital versioning. Produced by Jackson Tuber Studio and released on our publisher Talon Books website and on the book's Facebook page, the trailer features a performance art version of her poem Forever, which outlines a contemporary interpretation of the Gwasanta Tugaro Wampum Treaty. This was the first agreement made between Indigenous people and Dutch settlers in North America in 1613. From a Haudenosaunee perspective, this agreement, which prioritized peace and friendship, laid the foundations for all subsequent treaties. Gwasanta upholds the separate identity of the two peoples and a commitment to coexist in peace without interference in the affairs of the other. The Haudenosaunee initially recorded the treaty on a traditional wampum belt, a woven artifact made of mollusk shell beads, and that's a replica of the wampum belt. Although controversy exists regarding the authenticity of the paper treaty and the original wampum no longer exists, the Haudenosaunee maintain that their oral memory holds the more reliable record of the encounter. Historians who dismiss the treaty due to a lack of paper evidence reveal the Western privileging of the alphabetic archive. The Tugaro Wampum refutes settler colonialism by imagining a non-linear historical narrative that does not entail invasion and displacement. So I know we're used to hearing the word treaty related to Indigenous peoples as a bad thing, but this treaty in a kind of oral memory sense is upheld as a way to understand the relationship between European and Indigenous coexistence. Rogers asserts the authority of oral memory over print documents and rejects charges that the treaty is fake. Her title, Peace and Duress, evokes how white settlers have repeatedly violated this treaty agreement. So in addition to the video trailer, at least 5 different versions of the poem Forever can be found by searching online. While the printed poem spans only 3 pages, the online recordings vary widely in length, ranging from 3 minutes to 11 minutes. The longest recording is an audio-only version with musical accompaniment on SoundCloud. Her release of the video trailer as a sneak peek for her book positions Forever as an entry point into her broader poetic project with the Tugaro Wampum. Rogers' title, Forever, refers to one of the middle rows of the wampum belt. So you can see in the image there, the two purple, I don't know if you can tell it's actually purple, but the two darker rows represent a European ship and a Haudenosaunee canoe sailing in peaceful coexistence. And then the middle three rows the white rows are meant to symbolize peace, friendship, and forever. And so the kind of metaphor of the belt is that the two vessels are supposed to sail without crossing into each other's space through maintaining peace, friendship, and forever. And so Roger's video then is an enactment of that middle row, forever. So I'm gonna play you a short clip of the beginning of the video. If it cooperates.
Forever. As long as the sun shines upon the earth, as long as the water still flows, as long as the grass grows at a certain time each year, forever.
We're not getting the video picture. Oh, now it's going, okay.
Still in motion, still in motion. It's hard work to maintain the middle row. One line makes eyes separating sides. They navigate a boat in a similar river. Forever. We paddle a canoe as long as the sun shines upon the earth, forever separate. As long as the water still flows. As long as the grass grows at a certain time each year. Laws of respect. Intended to protect Mother Earth is still in motion. Still in motion. Words from good minds. Gazwente. It's hard work to maintain them. Not pretty like one line, but not separating side and boat. Every flow in large water, river, similar river. Buoyancy. We paddle beyond democracy. Boundaries. The canoe packing. The law was not authored in an angry house of disputes, but rather inspired from witness to cause and effect of free will, resulting in greed and corruption and unlawful.
Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm gone.
So the video, as well as the online versions of Roger's performance of Forever, deviate from the conventions of spoken word poetry recordings, which often make live, vocalized performance the focus. In an audio track, the sound editing trend is to highlight the voice and to filter out all other noises, except for perhaps, audio applause at the end to signify the live performance. Yet in Roger's video, we see no words coming out of her mouth. She uses extracts from the poem as a voiceover as she precariously walks barefoot on a path of white stones. Since the immediacy of the live event and the relationship between performer and audience play a central role in meaning production in oral traditions, recording technologies have been used to either document or recreate a sense of live performance. But Rogers deviates from what media scholar Jonathan Stern critiques as the preoccupation with fidelity in sound recording. Rather than use digital recordings to document her work, Rogers engages with these technologies as part of her artistic process. She makes her action, rather than her recitation, the focus to draw our attention to the paralinguistic elements of oral communication. So the smooth white stones that she picks up evoke the white mollusk shell beads used to make wampum. So she's embodying that weaving of the middle row of the placenta belt. To elongate the path, she returns to the beginning, picks up a stone and carries it to the end of the path and places it carefully down on the ground. By concretizing the belt as embodied action, she reveals that maintaining the treaty requires concerted effort to construct the path with every step that one takes. As Rogers repeats in the poem, it's hard to maintain the middle row. She suggests that the line of peace can be created only through continuous and careful motion. As she lightly steps from stone to stone and struggles to remain balanced, she demonstrates the need to minimize one's footprint on the earth. More importantly, her circular pattern represents the necessity of returning to the past to build a path forward. Although the wampum belt consists of straight lines, these lines are made from a recursive weaving process. Rogers disrupts lineal time and space. In fact, she dismantles it stone by stone. As Linda Tawa-Smith establishes in her foundational work, Decolonizing Methodologies, the line plays a central role in colonial thinking, quote, because it was used to map territory, to survey land, to establish boundaries, to mark the limits of colonial power. It also upholds a linear sense of time tied to progress. Rogers emphasizes a cyclical rather than a linear understanding of the concept of forever. Rather than associate forever with stillness, solidity, and paper, Rogers associates it with the shared mobility of land and people. Within a Western linear model, forever gets cast outside of time and history. Yet Rogers' recursive motion defines forever from the perspective of indigenous cyclical temporality. The setting changes in the video from an urban street to inside of an art gallery, and at the end she's at the shoreline, create a sense of multi-layered space and time. Rather than the two-row wampum being something that happened in the past, Rogers illustrates how each generation must continually weave it. She makes indigenous acts of resistance part of the spiral of time, part of the two-row wampum story as it is passed from one generation to the next. As she describes in Giving a Shit, another poem in Peace and Duress, about the First Nations protest movement, Idle No More, quote, "We are revisiting wampum, we are witnessing commitment," end quote. In her digital retelling of the two-row wampum, Rogers demonstrates how she uses her body to remember through movement and action. As compared to reading a poem, when we experience the poem orally and visually in a digital territory, we gain a more accurate understanding of the Haudenosaunee meaning of forever. Moreover, her multiple online versions of forever offer her audience multiple layers of access and interpretation. All right, so moving on then to Perez. He builds his challenge to linearity into the structure of his multi-book epic from unincorporated territory, and then builds on this online. He uses versioning and elaboration by repeating key concepts, stories, and phrases across the different volumes, and by posting excerpts from his poems on social media and releasing MP3 and video recordings of his work online. So far, he has published 4 books in the series, and each of the books contains interwoven poetic sequences that all begin with the word from, which is like the overall title. His fragmentary structure foregrounds the problem of belonging when one lacks full citizenship rights and cultural visibility as a person from an unincorporated territory. He focuses on his family's diasporic identity and the fact that over half the Chamorro population has been forced to live off island due to US militarization. His poems cultivate awareness about the history and status of Guahan, which continually gets erased from the US imaginary. From signifies both spatially and temporally to gesture beyond the space of the book. Perez notes in his preface to the opening volume that from can be traced back to the Old English fram, which originally meant forward movement, advancement, and then evolved into the sense of movement away. Countering narratives of linear progression, Perez's poetry hinges on the contradictory tension in from's etymology. Although it refers to the start of an activity or a journey, he underscores how, like the stroke of a canoe paddle, it pushes backwards to propel forwards. Similar to Rogers' Trail of Stones, Perez emphasizes returning to the past to create a decolonial strategy. His commitment to recover lost history is conveyed through his subtitle for his second collection, Sanya, which is the Chamorro word for parents, elders, spirits, or ancestors. But one of the things he makes clear in this collection is that to do such a recovery, you need to rely on the colonial archive. And the central metaphor of this collection is the Sackman canoe, which you see pictured on the cover for the book. And the Sackman canoe was a very fast canoe that was part of Chamorro pre-colonial life and sailing. And during colonization, they lost the knowledge on how to build this canoe, mainly because the Spanish forbid the Chamorro to actually sail the canoe, so they were forbidden from sailing. And in 2007, Perez celebrates in the collection that they finally managed to rebuild a Sackman canoe, and there was a Sackman canoe sailing on the Pacific Ocean for the first time, you know, in hundreds of years, and he celebrates this moment. But he also recognizes in that moment that in order to rebuild that canoe, they needed the colonial archive to figure out how to rebuild it. So he acknowledges that, but then also attempts to disrupt the colonial archive. And to do that, he incorporates Chamorro words into his texts. In describing the relationship between English and Chamorro in his poetry, he explains, quote, "I am not between two languages. One language controls me, and the other is a lost ocean. Wavelength, wave break. Not code, but compositions of history, story, genealogy, sound, change, meaning, practices." The Chamorro words create incomplete portals into the lost ocean of identity that have been destroyed by colonization. To encourage a different experience of poetic space, Perez also draws on the recursive structure of the traditional Chamorro poetic form, the Samarita. This almost extinct oral form involves one poet reciting a verse and another poet repeating the last two lines of that verse, and then adding their own lines in an ongoing improvisational collective sequence. These call and response poems played an integral role in everyday Chamorro life prior to colonization. They'd be sung during manual labor to pass on knowledge. Perez describes it as illustrative of, quote, the communal quality of Chamorro poetry, which creates a space for poets to sing forwards and backwards. He suggests that contemporary poets have revitalized the form through intertextuality in their written work, and that's certainly also true from unincorporated territory, which also has many intertextual references. Yet in this reproach, the call and response remains static and conceptual. To actualize it, Perez invites his audience to respond to him online. At the very end of his books, he lists ways that his readers can contact him. For example, in his second collection, he includes an email in his note about his poem From Tidelands. And that poem contains strike-through testimony by Chamorro activists to the United Nations Special Political and Decolonization Committee. He suggests people contact him if they, quote, would like to read other United Nations testimonies presented by Chamorros over the years, or if you're interested in helping the Chamorro people fight for our decolonization. Such a call breaks the poetic fourth wall to recreate the reciprocal dynamic of the Samarita. However, he does not ask his audience to respond with verse, but rather to respond by supporting the Chamorro struggle for self-determination. So, my last example, in his poem Licien San Galago, named after the dog tag that the Japanese required all Chamorros to wear at the start of the World War II occupation, he invites his readers to trace his poetic sequence off the page into online space. This sequence focuses on the US militarization's ongoing destruction of the island's ecosystem to challenge the official narrative that occupation ended when the US liberated Wuhan from Japan at the end of World War II. So the sparse poem contains 5 English words and 4 Chamorro words. And I'm not sure if you can see this in the image, but all of the words except Atadoc, which is the Chamorro word for I, are struck through in the box. His typography illustrates how imperial control makes connotative meanings remain obscure or only partly visible to the Chamorro eye. The other Chamorro words, Hanam means water, Nayuk means coconut palm, and Tano means land, along with the English words, suggest survival and sustenance. The large, bold number 8,000 with a question mark that sprawls across the border of the box dominates over the small words. The 3 URLs below include a petition to the United Nations about the military escalation on the island after 9/11, a blog post, Peace and Justice from Guam and the Pacific, and then another news blog about Guam. In the petition, one can find out that the significance of the number 8,000, which refers to the number of US Marines that were planned to be transferred from Japan to Guam in 2014. Perez takes a pedagogical approach because he knows that his audience needs additional context to decode the experimentalism of his work. Rather than write this in a footnote, he includes URLs to show how the poem is dependent on outside context for meaning. Since the book was published in 2008, visiting the blog also provides an updated perspective on the military buildup, since the most recent entry is from August 2017 and talks about North Korea's threats that they might attack Guam in response to President Trump's aggressive comments towards North Korea. Just as Rogers makes contemporary struggles part of the two-row wampum story, Perez unites his poem with the ongoing activist struggle for self-determination that continues beyond the page. The border around the words of the poem draw a reader's attention to the act of crossing a boundary, which parallels that move from page to screen. While Chamorro life remains suppressed and restricted within the box, the bold 8,000 represents how US Marines steamroll across the territorial boundary with no regard for those living there. To collaborate on the recovery of fragments from the lost ocean, Perez invites his audience to cross boundaries too, but in a different way from the Marines. On the surface, Perez's sprawling epic, composed of fragments, seems deeply tied to a page-based experimentalism that derives from the modernist long poem. Yet his poetry is more performative than it might initially appear. Through his engagement with digital forms to revitalize the Samarita, he creates a reciprocal poetic space where he invites his audience to navigate the lost ocean with him. Perez acknowledges modernist transbook poems such as Ezra Pound's cantos as an inspiration, at the same time as he critiques their complicity with imperialism. He stresses that, quote, one difference between my project and other long poems is that my long poem will always contain the from, always eluding the closure of completion. And many writers use the long poem formed to reject closure in some way, but Perez's rejection is less of an artistic conceit and more of a political absolute to underscore that he cannot envision a foreseeable end to the US occupation of Wuhan. From unincorporated territories, overflow across volumes, sequences, forms, and media produces a different kind of poetic space than the typical trans-book-long poem. Rather than trap the reader in a maze of unending pages, Perez's digital work shifts emphasis away from the page to emphasize the poem as an intersubjective encounter. Most trans-book-long poems challenge the idea of the book as a self-contained object, but only do so through a reassertion of the book as a container form. In other words, they cannot ultimately challenge the containment that they try to escape. For Perez, this parallels imperial territoriality too closely, in which the logic of expansion depends on the idea of islands as discrete insular spaces. So to conclude, for Perez and Rogers, decolonization entails overcoming the hidden barriers that carve up land and restrict people's movement. Accordingly, to revitalize Mohawk and Chamorro oral traditions, they prevent their poems from being confined to the page. Their remaking of a transmedia poetic space parallels their water-based critiques of imperial territoriality. They chart different ways of moving to produce a less territorial relationship to place. We often assume that digital technologies undermine our corporate identities, but they adapt online environments to produce a more embodied poetics. So much of our contemporary poetry world takes place online. We listen to recordings on sites like Penn Sound, we learn about poetry events on Twitter, we talk about poetry on blogs and social media. Rather than view them as mere extensions of our print universe, Perez and Rogers' interventions online call for an active remapping of these spaces to prevent the exclusions of our print world from being endlessly repeated.